Welcome to a new series of Jewish Wisdom on JTV. In our new studio, we're joined again with Rabbi Zobin. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's just jump straight into some hot topics. So, egalitarianism is something that has been on the rise for the last century, really, starting with, equality when it comes to the vote. Now we're starting to see more of it when it comes to issues of, I'm speaking specifically with regard to gender roles. We're seeing more equality in the workplace. Some people have felt that there's been a bit of a gap between this progress towards greater egalitarianism and moves in the Orthodox Jewish world. I suppose the first question to ask is would you say that Judaism does have an egalitarian outlook? And do you think there is a gap between sort of the egalitarianism within the modern world today and the way we see gender roles in Judaism? What do you think about that?
I think egalitarianism or equality is one of these phrases that needs a little bit of defining.
Sure.
And depending how one uses it, the response would vary. What exactly do we mean when we talk about equality? If we mean by that that everyone is equal in the sense that everyone is identical, possesses the same charisma, the same intelligence, the same health, the same appearance, the same wealth and resources, then clearly we don't live in an equal world. And it's hard to conceive of how such an equal world could ever be and whether that would be a good thing. To create equality in which all children are born into exactly the same environment, exactly the same family backgrounds, with exactly the same health and personalities and qualities, would be perhaps a boring world to live in, and certainly not one that would be feasible to create. So if that's what's meant by equality, then certainly Judaism, and I would argue life, doesn't subscribe to such equality. If, on the other hand, we mean equality in terms of the values that matter to Judaism, spiritual, moral, ethical development, and ultimately the ability to relate to oneself, to other people, and to God, then I would say Judaism is absolutely egalitarian. It believes that men and women are both able to become perfect human beings, developed human beings, moral and spiritual human beings, who have a close and personal connection with God. Indeed, our great Jewish leaders were both prophets and prophetesses, surely the peak of what a human can ascribe, can aim to achieve.
I'm still working on that.
Absolutely. And in that sense, it is egalitarian. The halachic system, the pathway outlined in the Torah to allow people to maximize their spiritual potential, is different between the genders. And these differences reflect not a lack of equality, but simply a different path to reaching that same ultimate goal, which is certainly equal between both men and women. I would suggest that that difference, in fact, is true to life. The biological functioning of a man and woman are different. This has a clear effect on personality and on relationships, on emotions, and on, therefore, the spiritual pathway they have. After all, the ability to bear a child and carry a child and bring a child into the world is a significant achievement, one that certainly in Judaism is at the peak of what human beings can achieve and what they can aim towards. And with such a significant spiritual dimension difference in their being, it would be surprising, on the contrary, if the spiritual pathway and the halachic system, therefore, is identical between the two. So if by egalitarianism you mean equality in the law, in halacha, equality in value as a human being, absolutely. If you mean the pathway, halacha after all means a path along which we can walk, then no, the two aren't identical.
Right. So I think there's a lot to unpack in that. The first part is I'd say, where do we see within maybe the Jewish texts that there is a clear understanding of there is a difference in roles? Are you saying this is just intuitive based on that we have different biology, or is there something that's actually within the text itself? That would be my first question.
There is no one particular source for this. There's several sources within the halachic system. And just going through a couple of them to give examples of these, perhaps the best well-known one is that positive time-bound commandments are not obligatory on women. Now this often goes unnoticed because it's certainly something that they can do, and if they do is a positive achievement, but nonetheless it's not an absolute obligation, commandment, or chiyuv. So, for example, listening to the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, a time-bound positive commandment, and therefore not an absolute obligation on women. And the reason for this is not to deprive women of an opportunity, they surely can do the mitzvah, as indeed we know they do, but is rather to allow them space so that they aren't restricted by this time-bound mitzvahs, by this time-bound commandment, and are therefore able to also focus on family and home if that is indeed what is necessary. Now, in our thinking, family and home is not a minor spiritual achievement. On the contrary, it's at the very peak and pinnacle of what a human being can do. What could be more wonderful than bringing another life into the world and producing a well-rounded, healthy, happy young child? If we look at the life of our great...
Where's the evidence for that? The not decreeing that time-bound laws should be applied to women. Where's the evidence that that is because of the fact that it's giving them more time to focus on family life? So, for example, some people argue that the reason why they were given this was because they were, let's say, not considered like first-class citizens, and often women were grouped together with children and servants in the Jewish texts, and so this is more sociological category. And now that we live in a time where women are more equal or are equal, we don't need to have these differences. What would you say to that?
One has to look at the source of these distinctions, how these distinctions work, and a pattern of general halachic relationship to the different genders in order to answer that question. So first of all, certainly when it comes to these set of commandments, this is not depriving them of anything. They are entitled to do the mitzvah, able to fulfill the commandment, simply not obligated to do so. And in a world in which we view obligations as perhaps less than always positive, surely having full access to a particular spiritual opportunity without the obligation to do so can't be viewed as a disadvantage.
Does it potentially make it a bit less meaningful experience for them, though, in a sense? Like, or is it a bit, some would say, condescending, that they... we don't need you to do this. We as a Jewish people don't need you to do this. Do you know what I mean?
I don't think so. I'm not sure that if one looked at the experience on Rosh Hashanah of listening to the shofar, there would be a difference between how the genders relate to that. I don't know. And I don't think it has to be viewed in that way at all. Again, choosing to engage with spirituality in a manner in which it's an expression of self-choice, certainly in the current Western way of thought, is an advantage, not a disadvantage. Though perhaps in Judaism, which is so commandment-based, you could argue it's otherwise. If we look at the values of the Torah, we look at the lives described of our great figures, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel and Leah. If we look at the lives of the forefathers and foremothers, we see that the centrality of home and the raising of family life is really at the essence of where spiritual achievement is genuinely
like Genesis is just
considered.
It's a family
Absolutely,
story,
of family. And it's a remarkable text in terms of the documents of the ancient world. It doesn't deal with wars, it doesn't deal with kings and nobles.
Right.
It deals with
finding wives,
interactions between husbands and wife, family relationships, tensions between siblings, and it's there that true spirituality begins. Judaism has always been a little bit suspicious, I would argue, of grandiose schemes. People who speak a lot about care for a class of human being, for a whole society, but in their individual lives and specific relationships and emotional connections aren't decent husbands, aren't decent wives, aren't good children, aren't positive parents. Judaism would be a little bit suspicious about their claim to indeed be spiritually sensitive and kind and ethical people. One can be a Lenin who talks at great length about the class and one's care for the working class, and yet on a personal individual level doesn't know how to treat someone decently. And that's not what we would call true spirituality. And that's why Genesis, the first book of the Torah, the foundational book of the Torah, that's starting off and the foundation upon which everything is later built, starts off by saying the keystone has to be home, family, out of that, broader family, community, nation, and ultimately, of course, the whole world. So in that sense, we are universalistic. We engage with the whole world, but we believe the building blocks of that have to start off from individual responsibility, personal connection, and that's something in which both men and women have a very deep and meaningful engagement with, but the Torah privilege is the role of women in that area, and indeed that seems to be true to how human biology, human nature is.
Fine, but what would you say to the fact that, and today we're starting to see marital roles and familial roles starting to be slightly more spread out between the genders, and therefore maybe that's something that could be recognised within the Jewish system. What would you say to that? Paternity leave now is starting to see as something that's a right given to fathers. Fathers are taking on some more of what would have been traditionally maternal roles. So what would you say to how that could be incorporated, or do you think it should be, or do you see that as a positive step? What's your take?
There definitely has been a shift, and in many respects that shift is positive. We understand today, in a way that wasn't understood even by some great thinkers in the past, that men and women are equipped with equal minds, with ability to achieve anything they wish in the outside world. And in fact, it emphasizes the equality that is at the essence of Judaism. All human beings, as the Mishnah teaches us, born of one person, because we are all equal. No one can look at someone else and say, my parents, my ancestors were greater than yours. So it's only a positive thing that we now understand that, and that we live in a world in which every person, man and woman, has access to the highest standards of education, both secular education and Torah education. So that is a positive. How this will ultimately affect the development of society, the centrality of family, I don't know, and I think the jury is still out. Whilst a certain shift was necessary and has taken place and is still taking place, and there's more to be done in that area, it's also clear that in the 21st century, we get married later, we have smaller families, we dedicate less time to perhaps the most important responsibility we humans have, which is raising the next generation and caring for them and bringing them up as positive. And how this will ultimately interact with society, with a possible breakdown of society, with a decadent self-interest and pleasure-seeking, I don't know, and we'll see how that unfolds. But I would certainly say that this is an experiment that we as humanity have embarked on, and an experiment that we don't know where it's heading and has a certain risk associated with it. And I would argue that we need a return to the centrality of family and family values. I'm not suggesting that in that we move back to an overly gender role assignment. And I certainly think it's a fantastic thing that I as a father, that we as parents are able to relate to our children more fully. But I think that if it goes too far, there could be a price to pay. And I think that halacha is a wake-up call and a reminder that we need to be sensitive and careful about that. And perhaps the conservatism built into the halachic system is a good thing, because it allows us to engage in a fruitful conversation and question and challenge some of the assumptions that aren't always critiqued. Halacha has built into it the possibility of flexibility within certain parameters and within a certain set framework. So not anything's possible in halacha, but there's a certain amount of movement, as we know, within how halachic system functions. Within the Jewish world itself, in the space of 100 years, the revolution triggered by Sarah Schneer in girls' education means that girls are now able to learn, women are now able in schools to learn Torah on the highest level. So halacha certainly allows such shifts to take place.
Why wasn't that happening, by the way?
If I just understand, it forces us to engage within the Beit HaMedrash, within conversation about that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's only a good thing, that when a society shifts, when a new value is introduced, the fact that we pause for breath, the fact that sometimes it takes us years or decades to thrash out an issue and to question it is a positive thing. To be a ger v'toshav, to be both a sojourner and a stranger in the broader society is a good thing. It allows us both to integrate with it and engage with it, but also to step back sometimes and question its assumptions.
So I want to pick up on just two things you said there. The first question would be, and I'll ask them both, and then you can respond to them you can pick and choose basically. But the first question would be about Sarah Schneer, who created this movement of formal education for Jewish women. Why didn't we see? Was education not a priority? The first question is, was education not a priority for women? In Jewish history up until that point. And the second question would be, we've certainly seen a shift in the role of public versus private roles and responsibilities among genders, much more kind of equality in the modern world. Is that something you would embrace, or would be a bit skeptical of? And I suppose what kind of comes also from that is, and that people would often be thinking when they're looking at this is, why doesn't that apply, or can we be flexible in Jewish prayer, which is the most obvious area in which there appears to be a lack of gender equality?
Okay, so these are.
I've literally just
yes,
loads of questions.
very rich points. Each one of which needs a lot of unpicking. I think there's several answers as to why there was relatively poor education for women pre the Sarashniya revolution. The first point to mention is that a lot of education actually in previous times took place in the home. Let's not forget that even the yeshiva institution in the modern form was only introduced about 80 years or 100 years before that, the Volozhin yeshiva opening. Until then, education had taken place within the community setting in the Jewish world, rather than within institutions that paralleled universities or colleges. So certainly for women, much of the education took place in home, in which they learnt from mothers and elders within the community. The second point is that, to some degree, probably the differences simply reflected the brutal facts of life, the expectations on men to go out and labour in the outside world and women to run the home, which pre the revolution in domestic appliances and so on took up most of the day. Mortality rates were shockingly high. People lived short and hard-working lives in which they didn't always have the leisure and the time to educate themselves. So that's perhaps a second point. The third point is we should recognise and be honest about this, that there were assumptions made and certain prejudices about the roles of men and women. And as I said, even great thinkers perhaps made mistakes in this area. Ramosha Feinstein, the foremost halachic authority of the last century, writes about this in one of his Teshavot, in which he says that the halachic system on occasion reflects societal norms, and therefore halacha is ultimately a realistic system, and therefore it will work within how the economy works, within the realities of what we said was often a short and brutal and tough life, and within some of the assumptions that society makes. And it will realistically accept that and try and move that forward in a positive way, nudge it forward in a positive way, but can't necessarily completely counter some of the assumptions that were there. The final point, though, to make is, and it gets back to the point I was making previously in your next question, that the adoption of a public role for women and public roles for women comes with a large number of positive elements, but also possibly a price to pay. It's positive in the fact that we're opening opportunities to human beings, and that can only be a good thing. But how that will affect home and the priority of home and family, we are slowly seeing and perhaps still have yet to see. And again, Judaism would say that the centrality of family, community is so important that we should question even positive developments if the price we're going to pay is going to be overly significant. So I don't have the answers here. Exactly what the balance is in the modern world is perhaps a conversation still ongoing, other than to say two things very clearly. I think it's a good thing, a wonderful thing, and a positive thing that women have access now to equal education and are able to be out there in the world. But equally, we need to monitor and view with care what price will be paid in terms of society and family, and that's equally and vitally important.
And what do you say with regard to the movement that calls for equality in regard to Jewish communal prayer services?
Yeah.
That say that women should be able to be called up to the Torah, they should be able to pray for the community.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
First of all, to just understand the halachic framework of this discussion, prayer is something that all humans need to engage in. This is not a Jewish need, this is a human need. Anyone who wants to build a relationship with themselves and a relationship with God needs to pray. It's something vitally important for all of us. The second point to make is that communal prayer, in some senses, is a self-contradiction. It's not an obvious thing that there should be communal prayer. The Hebrew word for prayer, palel, is a reflexive verb. It's something that one engages with oneself. It's self-judgment is the literal meaning, self-reflection, self-consideration, and ultimately a very personal and intimate conversation with God. The idea that we can pray as a community is strange and a little bizarre, and in some respects contradicts, one might think, the essence of prayer. Why do we take it for granted that there's communal prayer? Because that's what we're used to. But in many respects, actually, it's not what prayer should be about. Communal prayer was designed in order to allow one to get together with other people engaged in prayer, and in a sense, pays the price and accepts a certain superficiality and a certain harm done to the internal nature of prayer, but nonetheless necessary in order to allow the positives of a communal dynamic. For example, the most famous part of communal prayer, remarkably, the repetition of the Amidah, the Chazan, stands there in the front of the shul and sings their way through davening. Only introduced for those that aren't sincerely able to engage in personal prayer and therefore need that public form of prayer. It's a less good form of prayer. So if one person at the front representing us, whilst at best, which is what we ought to be doing, we're listening to their prayer and focusing on it, and at worst, actually, we're sitting talking to our neighbour in shul. So I think Judaism needs to be judged in terms of its own values and what it considers important. And whilst we live in a broader society that perhaps slips sometimes into seeing very public and communal roles as being that which is most important, and we as Jews also adopt that, this isn't really what the Torah is teaching us. The Torah teaches us that internal values, internal achievements are that which matter. So in a sense, the desire for a public role is not reflecting what we ought to see as that which is prestigious and that which is true achievement. That which truly ought to be valued is our own personalities, our own spiritual and emotional health, and our own ability to relate to other people and God. Public roles don't need to be, shouldn't be seen as all that is valued. And there seems to be a premise, I think a mistake in the premises of the conversation, in which somehow a public role is what really counts and what really matters, and therefore in depriving people of that opportunity, we're somehow stealing from them that which is most precious and most important.
It's a Western
Whereas in fact, in our own set of values, exactly, in our own set of values, this ought not to be, though all too often it is, that which really counts. Now, in terms of the ability to teach Torah and to engage in a public role in that sense, we as a society have that absolutely accessible. In terms of tefillah, there's nothing wrong with women forming prayer. There's nothing wrong with women forming prayer groups when they wish to do so, and davening, praying in their own in that manner. The halachic setup of repetition of the Amidah, of the idea of having a chazan engaged in communal worship in order to fulfill the obligation that others have, that is something which isn't possible without a minyan. And the context of this form of communal prayer is that of men, is that of a group of men. The reason for this is technical, because in order to exempt someone else through my own prayer, I need to be obligated in the equivalent, i.e. in the idea of communal prayer. And communal prayer is something that was necessary and therefore put in place for men, and isn't seen as necessary and therefore not put in place for women. They can engage in davening together as a group if they wish. And in fact, I would argue it suggests a different sort of leadership model. Not a leadership model in which you have one person at the front in a sort of hierarchical structure praying on behalf of everyone else, but in fact you have a group collectively davening. And if that's how people wish to daven, in fact in many places this takes place, women can get together and daven. If they wish to have the model in which one person is engaged in a formal prayer on behalf of everyone else in the manner of Amidah or Kriyat Torah, of the Torah reading, of learning, then that's not something that the halachic system offers.
And can you pinpoint why that is? So, for example, some people point to the fact that listening to a woman's voice in Orthodox Jewish law is problematic. Singing voice, I mean, is problematic. And some people would say, well, that's only if it's done to seduce, but if it's not done to seduce, well, then it's not an issue. So you're saying that the key focus is the question of leading the community, and the question is, why don't we have that opportunity for women?
There are various subsidiary halachic discussions that take place around this issue, including the issue you reference about women singing, a halacha that certainly is associated with the possibility of secularization and so on. In the sense that this is a distraction when we're talking about prayer, that isn't the core issue when it comes to tefillah. The core issue when it comes to prayer is that of prayer being a personal experience. The communal form of prayer created solely when, as I said, there is a minyan, a group of 10 men, reflecting the fact that for men, communal prayer is a halachic possibility, though not necessarily an ideal. As I said, the repetition of the Amidah is not necessarily an ideal, and not something that exists for women. Again, though, I think the deeper point is, one that we need to get our heads around, and perhaps is a little challenging in our mindset today. The deeper point is that the idea that a public role is the end-all and be-all of spiritual achievement is quite the opposite of how we think about things.
I get that. I'm just pinpointing why are we not going to offer that opportunity in prayer to, like, I understand
it's not we, I mean, it's the halachic system
yeah.
that doesn't offer it, because it wants the focus there to remain on that which is internal, and that which is perhaps more authentic and more real and more sincere and more genuine in that.
I'm saying, so then let's just allow Levites to do it, you know, to give, why are we saying, okay, we're going to draw the line at just only men?
We spoke before about egalitarianism and equality, and you are right. The halachic system is not equal in the sense of the pathway, the halachic pathway offered to different people being identical. Levites, priests, Kohanim have a different role to other Jews, and there are differences between men and women in role. We happen to now focus on some of the mitzvot, some of the laws, some of the commandments that uniquely apply to men, and look on those and say, well, this is something that women are being deprived of. The halachic system simply offers some opportunities to men, some opportunities to women. Mm-hmm. It happens to be that in the 21st century, the public roles which are seen as those which are most important are more often configured for men within the halachic system. And the reason that we can suggest with that difference is, as I said, because of the focus on home and family and internal values. Being a person who is focused outwards can contradict the inward focus that is needed to build a healthy home and family, and the halachic system reflects that. Once again, it doesn't deprive, beyond the very superficials of publicly being able to stand up and lead in an almost hierarchical manner, it doesn't deprive women of mitzvot in any way. It simply says some of them are obligations, some of them are opportunities, rather than just obligations, but things they can engage with. I think the only and predominant area in the halachic system where one sees this sort of clash of cultures is there in very public roles, which is unfortunate, because I think it's missing the point of actually the true message that's trying to be conveyed.
And can you see these things ever changing within the Orthodox framework, or not?
It's always hard to predict the future, and I don't know if pre the Saracenia revolution people would have seen that as coming. The way halacha is currently...
But that never really contradicted halacha. You know, saying we're going to have... I mean, maybe it did, I don't know.
Yes. The way halacha is understood, this is not a possibility. Halacha is an ongoing conversation, and it's always hard to predict exactly where a conversation will go. I believe in the halachic system. I believe that the halachic system has demonstrated over thousands of years its ability to balance two things, to remain true to the values, the inner values that permeate it, to allow change and development when it is needed to take place, and to allow this change to take place in a manner that doesn't offer a rupture with the past, that gives a sense of continuity, such that one can see how this is the same and yet allowing a new application. I am not worried about halacha and its ability to confront any of the ethical, moral or scientific developments that the future will bring, and I'm sure it will find answers that work. And I think that many genuinely passionate, engaged Jewish women find the current model one that is meaningful and offers spiritual growth to them. And I would simply say that one needs to question oneself when one is frustrated by the system as it currently is. Is what's frustrating one simply a determination to break a system which one sees as unequal? Or is it a genuine and passionate attempt to engage meaningfully with one's spirituality, with one's moral and ethical development, and with God? And perhaps the measure of that is one only pushing on areas where one perceives inequality, or is one also equally expending the same amount of energy in pushing on other areas of spiritual development? And if someone is genuinely engaging in every area of spiritual opportunity and spiritual life in the fullest halachic way, and isn't shirking away from mitzvot, from commandments in general, and isn't shirking away from other opportunities of spiritual development for men and women, then I would say their voice in this area needs to be taken seriously. In my view, those that are genuinely and passionately engaging with all the opportunities that are available, that fills a life. There isn't easy time available for more. And therefore, I think a lot of this is driven by a disquiet with the system as a whole. And there's a premise here that simply, in my view, you asked about what the future could bring. I don't know about every specific of halachic detail. I know one thing, though, that to my understanding, at the core of Torah is not an egalitarian system, if by that one means absolute equality in every respect. That seems to contradict the message of halacha, and it seems to be too interwoven into what Torah life is. I mean, I don't just mean about differences between the genders. I mean, in every sense, we human beings are different. Each and every one of us is different and has a different role, and that I can't see changing.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button, and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.